The winter of 2024 started out like any other in our quiet suburban neighborhood of Maplewood Estates, a planned community of about 200 homes nestled in the rolling hills just outside of Denver, Colorado, where the winters could be unpredictable but were generally manageable with the right preparation and a good snow shovel. But nothing could have prepared any of us for what meteorologists were calling the storm of the century, a massive blizzard system that was barreling down from Canada with unprecedented fury, promising to dump anywhere from 3 to 5 feet of snow across the Front Range over the course of just 48 hours. And as I sat in my living room watching the weather reports with growing concern, I knew that this was going to be a serious situation for everyone in our community, especially the elderly residents and those with mobility issues, who wouldn't be able to dig themselves out once the snow started piling up. My name is Marcus Chen, I'm 34 years old, and I've lived in Maplewood Estates for about 6 years now with my wife Jennifer and our 2 kids, Emma who's 8 and Tyler who's 6, and I work as a civil engineer for a construction company that specializes in infrastructure projects, which means I have a pretty good understanding of logistics, planning, and how to operate heavy machinery, including the beast of a plow truck that I'd purchased 3 years ago, after getting tired of paying excessive amounts to have our long driveway cleared every time it snowed. The truck was a 2015 Ford F350 Super Duty with a commercial-grade 8-foot hydraulic plow blade that I'd picked up from a guy who was retiring from his snow removal business. And while Jennifer had initially thought I was crazy for spending $15,000 on what she called my midlife crisis truck, it had proven its worth dozens of times over, not just for our own property but for helping out neighbors who found themselves stuck or buried after heavy snowfalls. And I'd never charged anyone a single penny because that's just not the kind of person I am. I believe in community, in helping your neighbors, in being the kind of person who steps up when things get tough rather than sitting back and expecting someone else to handle everything. The warnings about the blizzard started coming in about 4 days before it was supposed to hit, giving everyone plenty of time to stock up on supplies, charge their devices, and make sure they had enough food and water to last through what the authorities were saying could be a situation where roads would be completely impassable and emergency services would be stretched to their absolute limits. I made sure we had everything we needed at home: extra batteries, flashlights, a full tank of propane for our backup generator, plenty of non-perishable food, and I even went around the neighborhood, checking in on some of the older residents like Mrs. Patterson, who lived alone 2 streets over, and Mr. and Mrs. Kowalski, who were both in their 80s and didn't have any family nearby, making sure they had everything they needed and letting them know that once the storm passed, I'd make sure their driveways and walkways were cleared so they could get out if they needed to. The storm hit on a Thursday evening, right around 6 o'clock, and it started innocently enough with light flurries that the kids were excited about, pressing their faces against the windows and asking if they could go out and play. But within an hour the wind had picked up to the point where it was howling like some kind of primal beast, rattling the windows and making the whole house creak and groan. And the snow was coming down so hard and fast that you couldn't see more than a few feet in front of you, just a solid wall of white that swallowed everything in its path. By midnight, we already had over a foot of accumulation, and the weather service was updating their predictions upward, now saying we could see as much as 6 feet in some areas. Due to the intense banding and the way the storm was stalling out over our region, and I knew that this was going to be catastrophic for a lot of people in our neighborhood, especially those who didn't have the means or the physical ability to deal with this kind of snow load. I stayed up most of the night monitoring the situation, watching the snow pile up against our windows and listening to the emergency broadcasts on the radio, and by Friday morning when the kids woke up excited about a snow day, we had close to 3 feet of snow on the ground with another full day of heavy snowfall still ahead of us according to the forecasts. School was cancelled, obviously, and so was my work, along with pretty much every business in the metro area, as the governor declared a state of emergency and urged everyone to stay off the roads unless it was absolutely critical. But I knew that once this storm passed, there were going to be people in our neighborhood who were going to be trapped, potentially for days, unless someone did something about it. And the house contracted. Snow removal service was a small operation, run by 2 guys with pickup trucks who were decent enough at clearing the main roads through the neighborhood under normal circumstances, but who were going to be completely overwhelmed by a storm of this magnitude, assuming they could even get into the neighborhood at all given how bad the roads were outside our community. The Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association, or HOA as everyone called it, was run by a 5-member board of directors who took their responsibilities with a level of seriousness that often bordered on the absurd, and the board president was a woman named Cheryl Blackwood who had moved into the neighborhood about 8 years ago and had immediately made it her mission to enforce every single rule and regulation with an iron fist. Never mind that many of these rules were petty, outdated, or just plain ridiculous, like the one that said you couldn't have your trash cans visible from the street except on collection days, or the one that specified the exact shade of white you were allowed to paint your front door, or the one that prohibited any vehicle from being parked on the street overnight even during snow emergencies when your driveway might be completely blocked. Cheryl was in her worked as some kind of middle manager at an insurance company, and seemed to derive an inordinate amount of satisfaction from wielding what little power she had over the residents of Maplewood Estates. And she had a particular talent for making everything more complicated and bureaucratic than it needed to be, with endless forms to fill out for even the most minor modifications to your property and mandatory approval processes that could take weeks or even months for things that should have been simple, yes or no decisions. The other board members were generally more reasonable people. There was Tom Hendricks, who owned a small accounting firm and who usually tried to be the voice of reason. Sarah Martinez, who was a retired teacher and who genuinely cared about the community. David Wu, who was a software engineer and who mostly kept quiet during meetings. And then there was Patricia Morrison, who was Cheryl's closest ally and who seemed to agree with everything Cheryl said, regardless of how ridiculous it might be, which meant that votes often came down to 3-2 with Tom and Sarah on one side and Cheryl and Patricia on the other, while David played the swing vote depending on the issue. The HOA had rules about everything, and I mean everything, including a specific provision in the covenant, conditions, and restrictions, the CC&Rs, as they were formerly known, that stated that no homeowner was permitted to perform any work or services within the common areas of the neighborhood without prior written approval from the board, which common areas included not just the playground and the community center but also all the streets, sidewalks and even the grass strips between the sidewalks and the roads, a provision that had been written decades ago when the neighborhood was first developed and that was presumably intended to prevent residents from doing unauthorized construction or modifications, but that in practice gave the board the ability to control pretty much any activity that took place outside your own property lines. The storm finally started to taper off late Friday night, and by Saturday morning when I woke up and looked outside, I was stunned by what I saw. The entire neighborhood was buried under what had to be at least 5 feet of snow in most places, with drifts against houses and garages that were easily 8 or 9 feet high. Cars and driveways were completely invisible, just shapeless mounds of white, and the streets were impassable canyons of snow with not a single tire track or footprint visible anywhere, because nobody had been able to go anywhere for the past day and a half. The sky was finally clear, a brilliant blue that seemed almost surreal after 2 days of gray and white, and the sun was shining on all that fresh snow, creating a glare that was almost blinding, but beautiful too in a way that made you appreciate the raw power of nature, even as you recognized the massive challenge that lay ahead in terms of digging out from under all of this. I fired up my plow truck, which thankfully started on the first try despite the cold, and I spent about an hour clearing our own driveway and the area around our house, making sure Jennifer and the kids could get out if they needed to. And then I sat down with a cup of coffee to think about what to do next, because I knew that the HOA snow removal guys weren't going to be able to handle this. They'd be lucky to get the main entrance cleared by the end of the day, never mind all the side streets and individual driveways, and there were people in this neighborhood who were going to need help, people who had medical appointments, people who needed to get to work because they had essential jobs, elderly people who might need emergency services, and I had the equipment and the ability to do something about it, so why wouldn't I? I talked it over with Jennifer, explaining my plan to spend the day plowing out the neighborhood streets and helping people who were trapped, and she was supportive as always, telling me to be careful and to make sure I took breaks so I didn't exhaust myself. And then I bundled up in my warmest gear, grabbed some water bottles and energy bars, and headed out into the frozen wonderland that our neighborhood had become. I started with the main roads, the larger streets that connected the different sections of Maplewood Estates, working my way through slowly and methodically, pushing massive walls of snow to the sides and creating passable lanes that were maybe not perfect, but that were good enough for people to drive on, if they had four-wheel drive or all-wheel drive vehicles. And it was hard work, really hard work, because even with the powerful plow and the heavy truck, you could only push so much snow at a time before you had to back up and make another pass. and the snow was heavy and wet in some places and light and powdery in others, and the drifts were deep enough that I had to be careful not to get stuck myself, which would have been embarrassing and counterproductive. After about 3 hours of work, I'd managed to clear most of the main and I started to see other people venturing out, neighbors waving and giving me thumbs up as they carefully navigated the cleared paths, and a few people even stopped to thank me, rolling down their windows and shouting over the noise of the truck's engine about how grateful they were that someone was doing this, how they'd been worried about being trapped for days, how they had elderly parents or sick kids who might need to get to a doctor. And every thank you made me feel like this was absolutely the right thing to be doing, that this was what community was supposed to be about, people helping people, stepping up when it mattered most. I moved on to the side street, the smaller residential roads where most people lived, and this was even more challenging because these streets were narrower and the snow had drifted in ways that created massive obstacles, and I had to be careful not to damage mailboxes or landscape features that were hidden under all that white. But I persevered, working my way through street by street, creating paths that allowed people to at least get their cars out of their driveways and onto cleared roads. I'd been working for about 5 hours and had covered maybe 2/3 of the neighborhood, when I noticed a silver Mercedes SUV following behind me at a distance, and at first I didn't think much of it, figuring it was just someone trying to use the freshly cleared roads to get somewhere, but then I realized the vehicle was stopping whenever I stopped, maintaining that same distance. And there was something deliberate about it. That made me think whoever was in that car was specifically watching what I was doing. I finished clearing the street I was on, which was Oakmont Drive, where the Kowalskis lived, and I pulled over to take a quick break and drink some water. And that's when the Mercedes pulled up next to me and the window rolled down to reveal Cheryl Blackwood, the HOA president, bundled up in what looked like a very expensive fur-trimmed coat and wearing oversized sunglasses despite the fact that it was starting to get cloudy again. And the expression on her face was not one of gratitude or appreciation, but rather something that looked suspiciously like annoyance or even anger. "Marcus," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of forced politeness that barely concealed her irritation. "I've been watching you drive around the neighborhood for the past few hours, and I need to ask you what exactly you think you're doing." I was confused by the question because I thought it was pretty obvious what I was doing, but I answered politely, "I'm plowing the streets, Cheryl. Helping people dig out from the blizzard, you know, making sure everyone can get around and that emergency vehicles could get through if needed." She pursed her lips in that way she did when she was about to say something she considered very important. "I understand your intentions may be good, Marcus, but you're aware that the HOA has a contracted snow removal service that is responsible for clearing the neighborhood streets, and by taking it upon yourself to do this work without authorization from the board, you're operating in common areas without permission, which is a direct violation of Section 12.7 of the CC&Rs. I honestly couldn't believe what I was hearing. Here I was, spending my own time, using my own equipment, burning my own fuel, helping people who were trapped in their homes after a historic blizzard, and she was talking about CC and our violations and unauthorized work in common areas, and I tried to keep my cool as I responded, "Cheryl, with all due respect, this is an emergency situation. People need help. The HOAS guys aren't here and probably won't be able to handle a storm this size anyway. And I'm not charging anyone anything. I'm just being a good neighbor." She shook her head slowly. "That's not really the point, Marcus. The point is that there are rules and procedures in place for a reason. And when residents take it upon themselves to circumvent those rules, even with good intentions, it creates chaos and undermines the authority of the board. And furthermore, we have no way of knowing whether the work you're doing meets the standards that the HOA requires, or whether you might be creating liability issues for the association if someone were to get injured or if there were property damage." I was starting to get frustrated now because this was the most ridiculous conversation I'd ever had, and I said, "Cheryl, nobody's going to get injured because I'm clearing snow from the streets. If anything, I'm preventing injuries by making sure people can get out if there's an emergency. And as for property damage, I've been doing this for years and I know how to operate this equipment. I'm a licensed professional engineer, for crying out loud. I think I can handle pushing some snow around." She didn't like that response. I could tell by the way her jaw tightened and her eyes narrowed behind those sunglasses. "Your professional credentials in engineering don't give you carte blanche to violate HOA regulations, Marcus, and I'm going to have to ask you to cease this activity immediately and return to your own property. The board will discuss this matter at our next meeting and will send you formal notification of any decisions or actions that need to be taken." I just stared at her for a long moment, trying to process the fact that she was actually ordering me to stop helping people during an emergency, because of some technicality in a homeowners association rulebook, and I finally said, "I'm not going to stop, Cheryl. There are still streets that need to be cleared and people who need help. And if you want to write me up for that, or fine me, or whatever it is you think you need to do, then you go right ahead and do that. But I'm going to finish what I started because it's the right thing to do." Her expression went cold. "Very well, Marcus, you've been warned, and you'll be hearing from the board about this. I can promise you that." And with that she rolled up her window and drove off, her Mercedes navigating the cleared streets that I had just finished plowing, which struck me as deeply ironic, but I didn't have time to dwell on it because there was still a lot of work to do. I spent the rest of the afternoon finishing the streets I hadn't gotten to yet, and by the time the sun was starting to set around 5:30, I had cleared every single road in Maplewood Estates, creating a network of passable routes that connected the entire neighborhood and ensured that everyone could get in and out if they needed to. And I'd even taken the time to clear the driveways and walkways for Mrs. Patterson and the Kowalskis and a few other elderly residents who I knew wouldn't be able to handle that much snow on their own. I was exhausted, my back was sore, my hands were numb even through my gloves, and I was pretty sure I'd burned through about 40 gallons of diesel fuel and probably put some serious wear and tear on the truck's plow blade. But I felt good about what I'd accomplished. I felt like I'd made a real difference in people's lives during a genuinely difficult time, and as I drove home and saw all the families out in their yards building snowmen and kids sledding down the hills and people waving and thanking me as I passed, I thought, this is what it's all about. This is what makes a community strong. Jennifer had dinner waiting for me when I got home, and the kids wanted to hear all about my adventures plowing the neighborhood, and I told them stories that made them laugh and made them proud of their dad. And I went to bed that night physically tired but emotionally satisfied, thinking that whatever nonsense Cheryl wanted to pursue about CC and our violations was just her being Cheryl, and that surely the rest of the board would see, reason and recognize that what I've done was helpful and necessary and exactly the kind of community spirit that should be encouraged rather than punished. The following week passed without incident. Life slowly returned to normal as the city crews cleared the main roads and power was restored to areas that had lost it during the storm. And I honestly thought that maybe the whole thing with Cheryl had blown over, that maybe she'd talked to the other board members and they'd convinced her that pursuing any kind of action against me would be petty and vindictive and would make the board look bad in the eyes of the community. But I was wrong, because exactly 9 days after the blizzard, I came home from work to find an official-looking envelope in my mailbox, thick and formal with the Maplewood Estates HOA logo embossed on the return address, and when I opened it up, I found a multi-page letter that detailed alleged violations of the CC&Rs and assessed a fine of $800. $800 for what they termed unauthorized work in common areas, failure to obtain proper permits and approvals, and creating potential liability exposure for the association. The letter was signed by Cheryl Blackwood as board president and was written in this officious, legal-sounding language that made it sound like I'd committed some kind of serious crime, rather than helping my neighbors during an emergency, and it included citations to specific sections of the CC&RS and references to the HOA's legal authority to enforce its rules and collect fines from non-compliant homeowners, and it stated that I had 30 days to pay the fine or face additional penalties, including potential legal action and liens against my property. I was absolutely furious. Not because of the money, although $800 was nothing to sneeze at, but because of the sheer injustice of it. The idea that an organization that was supposed to serve the community and look out for the interests of homeowners was instead punishing someone for doing exactly what any decent person would do in that situation. And I showed the letter to Jennifer, who was equally outraged, saying, "This is insane. You helped people. You probably saved lives by making sure emergency vehicles could get through if they were needed, and they're fining you for it. We need to fight this, Marcus. We can't just let them get away with this." I agreed completely, but I also knew that fighting the HOA wasn't going to be easy. They had lawyers on retainer, and they had the authority granted to them by those CC&Rs that every homeowner had signed when they purchased their property, and taking them on was going to require strategy and probably help from others in the community, who were as fed up with the board's overreach as I was. The letter included information about my right to appeal the fine by requesting a hearing before the full board, so I immediately drafted a response, exercising that right and laying out in detail why I believed the fine was unjust. and why my actions during the blizzard should be recognized as beneficial to the community rather than violations of any rules. And I submitted that appeal within the required time frame, which was 72 hours, and then I started talking to my neighbors about what had happened. The response from the community was overwhelmingly supportive. People were shocked and angry when they learned that I was being fined for plowing snow during the blizzard, and several people volunteered to come to the appeal hearing to speak on my behalf, including Mrs. Patterson, who told me with tears in her eyes that if I hadn't cleared her driveway, she wouldn't have been able to get to her doctor's appointment, where they discovered a potentially serious heart condition that needed immediate treatment, and Mr. Kowalski, who said that at his age, trying to shovel 5 feet of snow would have probably killed him, and he was forever grateful that I'd taken care of it for them. I also heard from several other residents who hadn't been directly helped by my plowing but who were disturbed by the board's actions and who felt that this was emblematic of a larger problem with how Cheryl and Patricia had been running the HOA, treating it like their own personal fiefdom rather than as a service organization meant to benefit all the homeowners, and there was talk of possibly trying to recall the board or at least vote them out at the next election, which was still several months away. I started documenting everything, taking photos of social media posts where neighbors had thanked me for plowing, collecting written statements from people who wanted to testify about how my actions had helped them, and I even researched the legal concept of emergency necessity, which essentially holds that normally prohibited actions can be justified if they're necessary to prevent harm during an emergency situation. And while I wasn't sure how much weight that would carry in an HOA dispute, I figured it was worth including in my defense. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks after I received the initial fine notice, and it was to be held at the community center on a Thursday evening at 7 o'clock, and the board sent out a formal agenda indicating that my appeal would be heard along with several other routine matters, including approval of landscaping bids and discussion of pool maintenance contracts for the upcoming summer season. I prepared thoroughly for the hearing, creating a presentation with photos of the blizzard conditions, testimony from grateful neighbors, documentation of the emergency declarations that had been in effect, and arguments about why my actions should not only not be punished, but should actually be commended as an example of excellent community citizenship. And Jennifer helped me practice my delivery, offering suggestions on how to keep my emotions in check and present the facts calmly and rationally, which was going to be challenging because every time I thought about this situation, I felt my blood pressure rising. The night of the hearing arrived, and I was surprised to see that the community center meeting room was packed with people. Easily 50 or 60 residents had shown up, which was way more than typically attended HOA meetings where you'd usually get maybe 10 or 15 people at most. And it was clear that word had spread about what was happening and that people were interested in seeing how the board was going to handle this situation. And there was a definite buzz of conversation in the room as people waited for the meeting to start, with several people coming up to me to offer words of support and encouragement. The board members sat at a long table at the front of the room, with Cheryl in the center flanked by Patricia on her right and the other 3 members on her left. And Cheryl called the meeting to order at 7:05 and began by running through some standard procedural items and then the routine agenda matters, which seemed to drag on forever as they discussed minutiae about mulch colors and pool chemical suppliers, and I got the distinct impression that Cheryl was deliberately taking her time with these items to make everyone wait and to test people's patience, perhaps hoping that some of the crowd would give up and leave before we got to the main event. But people stayed. They sat there through 35 minutes of tedious HOA business, and finally Cheryl announced that they would now hear the appeal of Marcus Chen regarding the $800 fine that had been assessed for violations related to snow removal activities during the recent blizzard, and she asked me to come forward and present my case, reminding me that I had 15 minutes to make my presentation and answer any questions the board might have. I walked up to the front of the room, set up my laptop so I could show my photos on the projector screen, and began my presentation by describing the conditions during the blizzard, the unprecedented snowfall, the emergency declarations, the fact that people were trapped in their homes and that the HOA's contracted snow removal service had been completely overwhelmed and unable to respond in a timely manner. And I explained that I had the equipment, the expertise, and the willingness to help, and that's exactly what I did, spending an entire day clearing every street in the neighborhood at my own expense and without asking for anything in return. I showed photos of the massive snow accumulation, of cars buried up to their windows, of houses with drifts covering their front doors, and then I showed photos of the cleared streets after I'd finished my work, and I talked about the specific people I'd helped, mentioning Mrs. Patterson and her critical doctor's appointment, mentioning the Kowalskis and their age and physical limitations, mentioning the essential workers who needed to get to their jobs at hospitals and utility companies and other critical facilities, and I argued that what I had done was not only not a violation of any reasonable interpretation of the CC&RS, but was actually exactly the kind of community-minded behavior that should be encouraged and supported by the Homeowners Association. I then addressed the specific allegations in the fine notice, arguing that the unauthorized work in common areas provision was never intended to prevent residents from providing emergency assistance during natural disasters, that requiring proper permits and approvals before clearing snow during a blizzard was absurd and impractical and would have resulted in people being trapped for days longer than necessary, and that the claim about creating potential liability exposure was baseless fear-mongering, since my actions actually reduced liability by ensuring that emergency vehicles could access the neighborhood and that residents could evacuate if needed. I concluded by saying that I was requesting the board not only reverse the fine, but also formally acknowledge that my actions were beneficial to the community and establish a clear policy that residents would not be penalized for providing emergency assistance to their neighbors during natural disasters or other crisis situations. And I sat down feeling like I'd made the strongest case I possibly could, though I had no idea how the board would respond. Cheryl then opened the floor for public comment, and she clearly wasn't expecting the response she got, because immediately a dozen hands shut up and she had no choice but to start calling on people, and one after another. My neighbors stood up and spoke passionately about how grateful they were for what I'd done, how I'd helped them personally or how they'd witnessed me helping others, and how they thought it was outrageous that the board was punishing someone for being a good Samaritan. Mrs. Patterson spoke, her voice quavering with emotion, about how she might have died if she hadn't been able to get to that doctor's appointment, and how Marcus Chen was a hero in her eyes and should be getting a commendation rather than a fine. And Mr. Kowalski spoke about how, at 83 years old, he simply couldn't have dug himself out from under 5 feet of snow, and how he was disgusted that the board would treat a young man who had helped him so generously with such disrespect and ingratitude. Tom Hendricks, one of the more reasonable board members, asked a question about whether the HOA's contracted snow removal service had been able to respond during the storm, and I explained that I'd checked and they hadn't even attempted to enter the neighborhood until late Saturday afternoon, more than 12 hours after I'd finished clearing all the streets, and that when they finally did arrive, they'd basically just done some cleanup work on the main entrance and then left, confirming that they'd been completely overwhelmed by the magnitude of the storm and unable to provide the level of service that would have been needed. Sarah Martinez, the retired teacher on the board, asked whether I had any training or certification in operating snow removal equipment, clearly trying to establish that I knew what I was doing and wasn't just some random guy who could have caused damage or injuries. And I explained my background as a civil engineer, my years of experience operating the plow truck, and the fact that I'd completed a commercial snow removal operator training course a few years back just to make sure I was doing everything properly. And she nodded approvingly and made some notes. Patricia Morrison, Cheryl's ally, tried to ask some hostile questions about whether I'd consulted with the board before taking action and whether I understood that the rules applied to everyone, regardless of the circumstances. But several people in the audience actually shouted her down, calling her questions inappropriate and telling her to show some common sense and basic human decency. And I could see that she was taken aback by the hostile response from the community. She clearly hadn't expected this level of push. David Wu, the software engineer who usually stayed quiet, surprised everyone by speaking up and saying that he'd actually been one of the people trapped in his house during the blizzard with a sick child who needed medication, and that if Marcus hadn't cleared the streets when he did, David would have had to try to walk through chest-deep snow to get to a pharmacy, which would have been dangerous and potentially impossible. And he looked directly at Cheryl and said, "I think we need to seriously reconsider whether this fine makes any sense at all, because from where I'm sitting, Marcus did something extraordinary for this community and we should be thanking him, not punishing him." The public comment period went on for almost 45 minutes, with more than 20 residents speaking, and not a single person spoke in favor of the fine. Every single person who spoke either defended my actions or criticized the board for their handling of the situation, and you could see Cheryl becoming increasingly uncomfortable as the hearing went on, shifting in her seat and whispering to Patricia, clearly realizing that this wasn't going the way she'd expected. Finally, after the last person had spoken, Cheryl announced that the board would need to deliberate in executive session and would reconvene in 30 minutes to announce their decision, and the board members filed out of the room and into a side office, leaving the audience to wait and speculate about what was going to happen. The mood in the room was cautiously optimistic. People seemed to feel that we'd made a strong case, and that surely the board would see reason. But I'd been dealing with Cheryl long enough to know that she didn't like to back down or admit she was wrong, and I was worried that she might dig in her heels out of sheer stubbornness, even if the other board members wanted to overturn the fine. Jennifer grabbed my hand and squeezed it reassuringly, and several neighbors came over to tell me that regardless of what the board decided, they thought I'd done the right thing and they had my back, which meant a lot to me in that moment. After about 40 minutes, longer than the 30 minutes Cheryl had promised, the board members returned to the room and took their seats at the table, and Cheryl called the meeting back to order and announced that the board had completed its deliberation and was ready to render its decision on my appeal. She shuffled some papers in front of her, clearly drawing out the moment for dramatic effect, and then she began to read from a prepared statement. The board has carefully considered Mr. Chan's appeal, the testimony provided during the public comment period, and all relevant provisions of the CC and RS and HOA bylaws, and after thorough discussion, we have reached the following decision. The board finds that Mr. Chen did indeed engage in unauthorized work in common areas without obtaining proper approval from the HOA, and that this behavior constitutes a violation of Section 12.7 of the CC and RS as originally charged. However, the board also recognizes that these actions took place during extraordinary circumstances, specifically a historic blizzard that created genuine emergency conditions in our community, and that Mr. Chan's intentions were clearly focused on helping his neighbors, rather than any deliberate disregard for HOA rules. I felt my heart sinking because it sounded like she was about to uphold the fine, despite all the testimony we'd presented. But then she continued, therefore, the board has decided to reduce the fine from $800 to $200, and to issue a formal warning that any future unauthorized work in common areas, regardless of circumstances, will result in the full enforcement of all applicable fines and penalties. The room erupted in shocked disbelief. People were shouting, "That's ridiculous," and "You've got to be kidding," and "This is outrageous," because even though the fine had been reduced, the fact that they were still fining me at all after everything that had been said was just mind-blowing in its own deafness and vindictiveness. I stood up, probably angrier than I'd ever been at an HOA meeting, and I said loudly so everyone could hear me, "With all due respect, Cheryl, this is absolutely unacceptable. I helped people during a life-threatening emergency. I spent my own time and money to make sure this community was safe and accessible, and you're still fining me. And you're warning me that if I help people in the future during emergencies, I'll be punished even more severely. That's not leadership, that's tyranny, and I'm not going to pay this fine. Not $200, not $1, not 1 penny. And if you want to take me to court over it, then you go right ahead and do that, and we'll let a judge decide whether your interpretation of these rules makes any sense whatsoever." The crowd applauded. Many people stood up in support, and Cheryl's face turned red with anger as she banged her gavel and tried to restore order. "Mr. Chen, you are out of order. The board has rendered its decision, and if you refuse to comply with the assessment of fines, the HOA will have no choice but to pursue collection through all available legal means, including placing a lien on your property." I shot back, "Then place a lien. Cheryl, do whatever you think you need to do, but I'm not backing down on this, because what you're doing here is wrong, and everyone in this room knows it's wrong. And I suspect when the rest of the community finds out about this decision, you're going to have a much bigger problem on your hands than just me refusing to pay a fine." The meeting devolved into chaos after that, with multiple people shouting at the board members, several residents demanding to know how they could vote to remove Cheryl from the board presidency, and Tom Hendricks actually standing up and announcing that he was formally dissenting from the board's decision and that he thought the entire fine should have been dismissed, and that Marcus should have been given a community service award instead. And Sarah Martinez quickly added that she agreed with Tom and had argued for complete dismissal during the executive session but had been outvoted through. So it became clear that it had been Cheryl, Patricia, and David Wu who had voted to maintain some portion of the fine, with David apparently being swayed by Cheryl's arguments about maintaining the authority and rules-based structure of the HOA even though he'd personally benefited from my snow removal efforts, which struck many people, including me, as cowardly and hypocritical. The meeting finally ended around 10 o'clock, and as people were filing out, Multiple neighbors came up to me to offer their support. Several people said they wanted to help me fight the fine however they could, and one guy named Rick Samuelson, who was a lawyer, though he practiced family law rather than HOA law, said he'd be willing to represent me pro bono if it came to legal action. And another woman named Janet Rodriguez, who had some experience in community organizing, said she wanted to start a petition to recall the board and force new elections. I went home that night emotionally drained but also energized by the outpouring of support from my neighbors. And Jennifer and I stayed up late talking about what to do next, and we decided that we were going to fight this on principle, not just refuse to pay the fine but actively work to change the leadership of the HOA and establish better policies that would prevent this kind of nonsense from happening to anyone else in the future. Over the next several days, things moved quickly on multiple fronts. Janet Rodriguez created an online petition calling for the recall of Cheryl Blackwood and Patricia Morrison from the HOA board, and within 48 hours it had been signed by more than 120 residents out of the 200 homes in Maplewood Estates, which was a clear majority and showed just how fed up people were with the board's leadership. Rick Samuelson, the lawyer who had offered to help me, looked into the HOA's bylaws and the relevant state laws regarding homeowner associations, and he discovered that there were actually some significant procedural problems with how the fine had been assessed, including the fact that the board hadn't provided adequate notice of the hearing as required by state law, and that the executive session they'd held to deliberate on my appeal might have violated Colorado's common interest community laws, which required certain decisions to be made in open session. He drafted a formal legal response to the HOA's fine assessment, laying out these procedural deficiencies and arguing that the fine was invalid and unenforceable, and he sent that letter to the board along with a demand that they withdraw the fine entirely or face potential legal action not just from me, but possibly from other homeowners who might have claims related to the board's pattern of procedural violations. I also started documenting everything that had happened, writing up a detailed account of the blizzard, my snow removal efforts, the fine assessment, and the appeal hearing, and I posted this on the neighborhood's Facebook page and on a community forum website that many residents used, and the response was overwhelming. Hundreds of comments from people expressing outrage at the board's actions, sharing their own stories of HOA overreach and pettiness, and pledging their support for efforts to reform the association's leadership and policies. The local news somehow got wind of the story. I suspect someone from the neighborhood reached out to them, and a reporter from one of the Denver TV stations called me asking if I'd be willing to do an interview about what had happened, and after discussing it with Jennifer, I decided that yes, publicity could actually help our cause by putting pressure on the board and showing the broader community what was going on in Maplewood Estates. The interview aired on the evening news 2 days later, a 4-minute segment that included footage of the blizzard, shots of my plow truck, interviews with me and with Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Kowalski, who talked about how I'd helped them, and a brief statement from Cheryl, who had agreed to a phone interview and who came across as defensive and rigid, insisting that rules were rules and that the board had to enforce the CC and RS uniformly regardless of circumstances, which I think actually hurt their position because she sounded so unsympathetic and bureaucratic. The story was titled "Good Samaritan Fined by HOA for Helping Neighbors During Blizzard," and it resonated with viewers. The station's Facebook page was flooded with comments criticizing the HOA and supporting me, and the story got picked up by other local media outlets and even by some national news websites that cover interesting human interest stories. And suddenly, our little HOA dispute in suburban Denver was getting attention from people all over the country. Thousands of people weighing in on social media about how ridiculous HOAs could be and how my situation was emblematic of a larger problem with these organizations, prioritizing rules and authority over common sense and community welfare. The publicity created enormous pressure on the HOA board, and I heard through the grapevine that Cheryl was furious about the media coverage and was blaming me for making the association look bad, which I thought was rich considering that she was the one who had created this entire situation by deciding to find someone for helping people during an emergency. The board called an emergency meeting, which was announced with only 3 days' notice instead of the usual 7 days required by the bylaws, which Rick Samuelson immediately pointed out was yet another procedural violation. And the stated purpose of the meeting was to address recent concerns raised by homeowners regarding board policies and procedures, which was bureaucratic language for try to do damage control before this situation completely spirals out of control. The meeting was even more packed than the appeal hearing had been, with probably 80 or 90 people crammed into the community center meeting room, and there was a definite atmosphere of hostility toward the board. People were angry and they weren't hiding it. There were handmade signs that said things like, "Cheryl must go and support good neighbors, not bad rules, and HOAs should serve homeowners, not control them." And Cheryl looked visibly uncomfortable as she called the meeting to order and tried to maintain some semblance of authority over what was clearly going to be a contentious session. She started by making a prepared statement about how the board valued all homeowners' input and took concerns seriously and wanted to work collaboratively to address any issues. All the usual corporate speak that meant absolutely nothing. And then she opened the floor for public comment, and for the next 90 minutes she and the other board members got absolutely hammered by resident after resident standing up and expressing their anger and frustration, not just about my situation but about a whole range of issues related to the board's leadership. People talked about how their minor violations had resulted in excessive fines, about how the approval process for simple home improvements was unnecessarily complicated and delayed, about how the board seemed more interested in exercising power than in actually serving the community, and about how Cheryl in particular had created a culture of fear and overregulation that made people feel like they were living in some kind of authoritarian regime rather than a neighborhood of fellow homeowners who should be supporting each other. Tom Hendricks, the reasonable board member who had dissented from the decision to fine me, took the extraordinary step of using his position at the table to essentially join the criticism of the board's leadership, saying that he'd been concerned for a long time about the direction the board was taking and that the situation with Marcus's fine was just the latest and most egregious example of policies and decisions that didn't serve the community's best interests. And he announced that he was formally proposing several policy changes, including a complete revision of the fines and penalty schedule, the creation of a formal exception process for emergency situations, and the establishment of a community advisory committee that would provide input to the board on major decisions. And Sarah Martinez immediately seconded all of those proposals, which meant that there would have to be votes on them at a subsequent meeting. Cheryl tried to maintain control of the meeting, but it was clear that she'd lost the room, and when someone in the audience made a motion to have a vote of no confidence in her leadership as board president, she ruled the motion out of order, claiming it wasn't on the agenda. But Rick Samuelson stood up and cited the specific section of the bylaws that allowed for such motions to be made during any properly noticed board meeting, as long as they related to board governance. And he challenged Cheryl's ruling, and after a brief consultation with Patricia Morrison and what looked like a very uncomfortable David Wu, Cheryl grudgingly agreed to allow the vote, probably realizing that refusing would just make her look even more dictatorial and would give people more ammunition to use against her. The vote was taken by show of hands of all homeowners present, and the result was overwhelming. Something like 75 people voted in favor of the no-confidence motion and only about 8 voted against it, with a few abstentions. And while this vote wasn't technically binding under the bylaws, it was a clear signal from the community about what they thought of Cheryl's leadership, and you could see the impact on her face. The realization that she'd lost the support of the vast majority of the community and that her position as board president was essentially untenable regardless of what the formal rules might say about terms and elections. The meeting finally ended around 11 o'clock, and as people were leaving there was a definite sense that something important had happened, that we'd reached a turning point in the fight against the HOA's overreach, and multiple people approached me to say that regardless of what happened with the fine itself, they were grateful that I'd stood up to the board and helped spark this larger conversation about how the HOA should be run and what kind of community we wanted to live in. Jennifer was proud of me, though also exhausted by the whole ordeal, and the kids were confused about why Daddy was suddenly on TV and why all these people were talking about him. But we explained it to them in age-appropriate terms, about standing up for what's right even when authority figures tell you you're wrong. And I think there was a valuable lesson in there for them about citizenship and courage and not backing down from bullies just because they have some official title or position. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The petition to recall Cheryl and Patricia gathered enough signatures to force a special election under the HOA's bylaws, which required signatures from at least 25% of homeowners to initiate a recall. And we'd gotten well over 40%. So there was no question that the recall would move forward. Rick Samuelson continued to press the legal issues around the fine, and he filed a formal complaint with the state's regulatory agency that oversees homeowner associations, alleging multiple procedural violations and seeking an investigation into the board's practices. and while that process would take months to resolve, it added another layer of pressure on Cheryl and the board to settle the matter before it became an even bigger mess. Cheryl tried to salvage her position by suddenly becoming more conciliatory. She released a statement saying that perhaps the board had been too rigid in interpreting the rules, and that they were committed to reviewing their policies and being more responsive to community input. But it was too little too late. The damage was done, and nobody believed that she'd actually changed her fundamental approach to HOA governance. They saw it as a transparent attempt to avoid being recalled and maintain her power. The special recall election was scheduled for 6 weeks after the petition was certified, and during that time there was active campaigning by both sides, though the anti-Cheryl forces had much more energy and grassroots support, with yard signs and door-knocking and social media campaigns, while Cheryl and Patricia mostly tried to rely on formal mailings to homeowners arguing that the recall was unnecessary and disruptive, and that they should be allowed to complete their terms. But their arguments fell flat because people had seen firsthand how they operated and weren't interested in giving them more time to continue those practices. I tried to stay somewhat in the background during the campaign, not wanting to make it all about me and my specific situation, but rather about the broader principles of community governance and resident rights, though inevitably I became something of a symbol for the reform movement, and people would refer to the Marcus Chen situation as shorthand for everything that was wrong with the current board's approach. The recall election was held on a Saturday morning at the community center, with voting open from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. to make sure everyone had plenty of opportunity to participate. And the turnout was extraordinary. More than 70% of homeowners cast ballots, which was unprecedented for any HOA election in Maplewood Estates history, where typical turnout might be 20 or 25% at best. The results were announced that evening at a special meeting, and they were decisive. Cheryl Blackwood was recalled by a vote of 131 to 53, and Patricia Morrison was recalled by a vote of 128, clear majorities that sent an unmistakable message about what the community thought of their leadership, and both of them were required to vacate their board positions effective immediately. The bylaws required that a special election be held within 30 days to fill the vacant board seats, and there was no shortage of candidates. Several well-qualified and community-minded residents stepped forward to run, including Janet Rodriguez, who had organized the initial recall petition, and a guy named Marcus Stone, no relation to me despite the same first name, who was a retired city planner and who had lots of experience with community governance and development issues. The election for the new board members was held 4 weeks later, and the reformed candidates won by comfortable margins, and at the first meeting of the newly constituted board, Tom Hendricks was elected as the new president, with Sarah Martinez as vice president, and one of their first actions was to formally rescind the fine that had been assessed against me, voting unanimously to dismiss it entirely with an acknowledgement that my snow removal efforts during the blizzard had been a valuable service to the community and that the previous board's decision to fine me had been an error in judgment that didn't reflect the values of Maplewood Estates. But they didn't stop there. The new board also passed a comprehensive package of reforms that Tom and Sarah had been working on, including a complete overhaul of the fines and penalties system to make it more reasonable and proportionate, the creation of a formal exception process for emergency situations and other extraordinary circumstances, the establishment of a community advisory committee that would provide input on major decisions and help ensure that the board stayed connected to residents' concerns and priorities, and a commitment to greater transparency in board operations, including publishing detailed minutes of all meetings online and providing regular updates to the community about association finances and activities. They also voted to conduct a complete review of the CC&Rs with input from homeowners about which provisions were outdated or unnecessarily restrictive, with the goal of proposing amendments that would be voted on by the full community at the next annual meeting. And there was genuine excitement about the possibility of reforming some of the most programmatic rules that had been causing friction for years. Things like the overnight parking restrictions, and the excessive controls over landscaping and home modifications that went way beyond what was necessary to maintain property values and neighborhood aesthetics. The whole experience taught me a lot about community organizing, about the importance of standing up for your principles even when it's difficult or risky, about how grassroots movements can affect real change when people come together around shared values and concerns, and about how institutional power can be challenged and reformed when enough people decide that the status quo is unacceptable. It also reinforced my belief in the importance of community and neighborliness. The whole reason I'd gotten into this situation in the first place was because I believed in helping people and being the kind of neighbor who steps up when others need assistance. And while I'd never expected that doing something as simple as plowing snow would turn into this whole big thing with recalls and media coverage and political drama, I didn't regret any of it because the outcome was ultimately positive, not just for me, but for everyone in the neighborhood. The new board started off strong. They were responsive to homeowners. They made decisions based on common sense rather than rigid adherence to rules for the sake of rules. And they fostered a much more collaborative and positive atmosphere in the community. And I heard from multiple people that they felt like Maplewood Estates was finally starting to feel like a real neighborhood, again rather than some kind of corporate managed property where you had to watch your step constantly to avoid violating some obscure regulation. As for Cheryl and Patricia, they both moved out of the neighborhood within 6 months of being recalled, whether because they were embarrassed by what had happened or because they just couldn't stand living in a community where they'd lost so much face and authority, I don't know. But their houses went up for sale in the spring and they were both gone by summer. And I can't say I was sorry to see them go, though I tried not to be petty about it. I'd made my point and won my fight, and there was no need to gloat or rub it in. The next winter brought another significant snowstorm. Not quite as bad as the blizzard that had started everything, but still a solid 15 inches that needed to be dealt with. And this time when I fired up my plow truck to clear my driveway, Tom Hendricks actually called me and asked if I'd be willing to help clear some of the neighborhood streets. Again, since the contracted snow removal service was delayed. And he said the board had discussed it and they wanted to formally authorize me to do this work and even offered to reimburse me for my fuel costs, which I declined because I still didn't want to be paid for helping my neighbors. But I appreciated the gesture and the recognition that what I was doing was valuable and supported by the community leadership. I spent that day clearing streets just like I had during the big blizzard, and this time instead of getting threatening letters and fines, I got thank you notes and cookies and even a formal certificate of appreciation from the HOA at the next board meeting, which was a nice symbolic gesture that showed how much things had changed in just 1 year. Looking back on the whole experience now, a couple of years later, I think about how one simple act of kindness and community service triggered this whole chain of events that ultimately transformed our neighborhood's governance and culture, and I'm proud of the role I played in that transformation. Even though it wasn't easy and there were times when I questioned whether it was worth all the stress and conflict, but I think it was worth it, not just because I avoided paying an unjust fine or because I helped get some problematic board members removed from power, but because we established important principles about how communities should function, about the balance between rules and flexibility, about the importance of common sense and compassion in governance, and about the power that ordinary residents have when they stand up together for what they believe is right. I still live in Maplewood Estates, and I still have my plow truck, and I still help out my neighbors whenever they need it, whether that's clearing snow or helping someone move heavy furniture or just being available when people need advice or assistance with something, because that's what community is supposed to be about, people looking out for each other and contributing what they can to make everyone's lives a little bit better, and no HOA rule or board president or fine is ever going to change my commitment to being that kind of neighbor and that kind of person. The story of how I got fined $800 for plowing snow during a blizzard and then helped spark a community revolution that changed our HOA's leadership and policies became something of a legend in our neighborhood, and people still talk about it. Sometimes newcomers who move in will hear the story and want to meet the snowplow guy who took on the HOA, and I always feel a little embarrassed by the attention, but also grateful that the story continues to inspire people to think critically about how their communities are governed and to speak up when they see injustice or overreach. Jennifer jokes that I should write a book about it, or at least submit the story to one of those online forums where people share tales of HOA horror stories and revenge. But I've always felt like the real value of what happened wasn't in the drama or the conflict, but in the positive changes that came out of it. The way our neighborhood became a better, more cohesive place where people feel empowered to participate in governance, and where the HOA actually serves the interests of homeowners rather than treating them as subjects to be controlled and regulated. My kids are older now. Emma is 10 and Tyler is 8, and they remember the winter when Dad was on TV, and sometimes they ask me about it, and I try to teach them the lessons I learned from the experience, about standing up for what's right even when authority figures tell you you're wrong, about the importance of community and helping others, about how positive change is possible when people work together, and about how sometimes doing the right thing can be complicated. and messy, but it's still worth doing, because your actions can have impacts that extend far beyond what you initially imagined. The reforms that the new HOA board implemented have held up well over time. The Community Advisory Committee has become an important part of how decisions get made, providing valuable input and helping ensure that the board stays connected to residents' priorities. And the revised fines and penalties system is much more reasonable and proportionate, focusing on addressing genuine problems rather than generating revenue or exercising arbitrary authority. The CC&R amendments that were eventually voted on and approved by the homeowners eliminated some of the most problematic and outdated provisions, making it much easier for people to make reasonable modifications to their properties and live their lives, without constantly worrying about technical violations of obscure rules. And the overall culture of the HOA has shifted from one of control and enforcement to one of service and support, which is what it should have been all along. We still have rules, of course. Any community needs some basic standards to maintain property values and ensure compatibility between neighbors. But the rules are now applied with common sense and flexibility, with an understanding that the purpose of the HOA is to enhance the community, rather than to burden it with bureaucracy and petty regulations. And that distinction makes all the difference in how people feel about living here and how they engage with their neighbors and with the association itself. I sometimes think about Cheryl and wonder what she thinks about everything that happened, whether she has any regrets about how she handled the situation or whether she still believes she was right to enforce the rules the way she did. And I suspect she probably feels like she was treated unfairly and that the community overreacted. But I also think that's a failure of self-reflection on her part, an inability to see how her rigid adherence to rules and her need to exercise authority had created an environment where a simple act of kindness during an emergency could be treated as a violation worth punishing. The irony is that if she had just ignored what I did, or better yet, if she had thanked me for it, none of the subsequent drama would have happened. She'd probably still be board president and still running the HOA the way she wanted to. But by deciding to make an example of me and prove that nobody was above the rules, she triggered a backlash that ended up costing her everything she'd built in terms of her position and influence in the community. And there's a lesson in that about the dangers of letting your need for control override your judgment and your humanity. For me personally, the experience changed how I think about civic engagement and community participation. Before all this happened, I was pretty much apathetic about HOA politics. I'd never attended a board meeting. I didn't pay much attention to what the board was doing as long as they kept the common areas maintained, and didn't bother me too much. But now I'm much more engaged. I attend meetings regularly. I serve on a couple of committees, and I encourage other residents to get involved and stay informed about what's happening because I've seen firsthand how much difference it can make when people pay attention and speak up. I've also become something of an informal advisor to people in other neighborhoods who are dealing with their own HOA issues. I've gotten emails and messages from people all over the country who heard about my story and want advice on how to challenge unjust fines or reform problematic boards. And while I'm not an expert and I always tell people to consult with actual lawyers and HOA specialists, I try to share what I learned from my experience about the importance of documentation, community organizing, media engagement, and persistence, because these tools are available to anyone who's willing to use them, and they can be surprisingly effective at creating change even when you're up against what seems like an immovable institutional force. The local media still occasionally does follow-up stories on what happened, especially during winter when snow removal becomes a relevant topic again. And they've done a few pieces about how our HOA reforms have worked out and whether other communities have learned anything from the Maplewood Estates situation. And from what I can tell, there has been some broader impact. Other HOAs in our area and beyond have looked at what happened here and decided to review their own policies and make changes to avoid similar conflicts. And there's been some discussion at the state level about whether HOA regulations need to be reformed to provide more protections for homeowners and more accountability for boards, though that's a slow process that involves lobbyists and legislators and all the complications of the political system. But the fact that a conversation is happening at all feels like progress, and I'm glad that our local fight might contribute in some small way to broader changes that could benefit people and communities all across the country who are dealing with overreaching or dysfunctional HOAs. Looking at the bigger picture, I think the story of what happened in Maplewood Estates is really about the tension that exists in a lot of American communities between individual freedom and collective governance. between the desire to live your life as you see fit and the need for some shared standards and rules to maintain community cohesion and property values. And finding the right balance between those competing values is always going to be challenging. But I believe it's possible if the people making the rules approach their responsibilities with humility, common sense, and a genuine commitment to serving the community rather than controlling it. The HOA model isn't inherently bad. In theory, these associations can provide valuable services and help maintain neighborhood quality. But they can also become instruments of petty tyranny when the wrong people end up in charge, or when the rules become ends in themselves, rather than means to legitimate community goals. And preventing that requires constant vigilance from homeowners, a willingness to participate in governance, and the courage to speak up when things go wrong, all of which can be inconvenient and time-consuming, but which are necessary if we want to live in communities that reflect our values and serve our interests. As I finish telling this story, I'm sitting in my living room looking out at the same streets I cleared during that blizzard 3 years ago, and everything looks peaceful and normal. Kids are playing in the park, neighbors are out walking their dogs, someone down the street is working on their garden, and it's hard to believe that this quiet suburban neighborhood was once the site of such intense conflict and drama. But it was, and that conflict led to real changes that have made this a better place to live, not just for me but for everyone here. And that's something worth remembering when you're faced with a situation where you have to decide whether to stand up for what you believe is right or just go along to get along. I chose to stand up. It cost me time and energy and stress. It put me in conflict with authority figures and put me in the spotlight in ways that weren't always comfortable. But it was worth it because the outcome was positive change that will benefit this community for years to come. And I'd make the same choice again in a heartbeat because that's what being a good neighbor and a good citizen means. Not just following the rules but questioning them when they don't make sense. Not just accepting what authority figures tell you but holding them accountable when they abuse their power. And not just taking care of yourself and your own family but looking out for the broader community and being willing to sacrifice something of your own for the common good. So if you take anything away from this story, I hope it's this. Don't be afraid to do the right thing even when it's hard. Don't let unjust rules or petty bureaucrats stop you from helping people who need help. Don't assume that you can't make a difference just because you're one person up against an institution. And don't underestimate the power of community when people come together around shared values and common purpose. Because my experience taught me that all of those things are possible if you're willing to stand up, speak out, and see it through to the end, no matter how long that takes or how difficult it gets along the way. And while I never expected that plowing snow during a blizzard would turn into this whole saga, I'm grateful for everything that came out of it, the friendships I strengthened, the positive changes we created, and the lessons I learned about what really matters in building and maintaining a strong, healthy, vibrant community where people look out for each other and where the institutions that govern us actually serve our interests rather than their own. And that's the kind of community I want to live in, the kind of community I want my kids to grow up in, and the kind of community that I think we all deserve, regardless of where we live or what kind of governance structures we have. Because at the end of the day, we're all just neighbors trying to make our way in the world. And we're better off when we help each other than when we fight each other, when we cooperate rather than compete, and when we approach our shared challenges with generosity and good faith rather than suspicion and hostility. The end.